Mercedes just did something in China that should not be possible in Formula One. Not just winning, not just dominating. They made the limits disappear. While every other team was managing energy, losing power at the end of straights, fighting unpredictable cars, Mercedes didn't slow down. Not once. Lap after lap. Flat out. And here's the part that changes everything. Verstappen just revealed what these cars really feel like. Heavy. Unstable. Impossible to trust. He said every lap feels like survival. So now ask yourself this. If every driver is fighting the car, why do Antonelli and Russell look like they're in complete control? Because there are only two answers. Either Mercedes has solved Formula One before anyone else, or they found something no one was supposed to find. And now, the entire paddock is starting to notice. The FIA is watching. Rival teams are questioning. And what happened in China might be the beginning of something much bigger. So the real question is not how Mercedes won. The real question is, what did Verstappen just expose, without even saying it? What makes this even more shocking is that Verstappen didn't just complain. He described a completely different reality. Because everything he said after China does not match what we saw from Mercedes. At all. He talked about instability. About cars that feel heavy, disconnected, unpredictable. About constantly managing energy. Constantly adapting. Constantly surviving. And then you look at the W17. And it's the opposite. Stable in high speed. Precise on entry. Clean on exit. No corrections. No hesitation. Just smooth, controlled performance. And that contrast is where the real story begins. Because in Formula One, when one team experiences chaos, and another experiences total control, something doesn't add up. Now think about the race itself. Verstappen is fighting through traffic, managing tires, trying to stay within a very narrow window. And just when it looks like he can still recover something, the car fails. Complete loss of power. Race over. Meanwhile, Antonelli is leading. Calm. Building a gap. Managing everything like it's under control. Russell behind him. No pressure. No instability. And that difference is too big to ignore. Now here's where it gets even more important. Because this is not just about driving. It's about how the system behaves. These new cars are built around energy. Everything depends on it. Deployment, recovery, balance. And every team is dealing with the same limitations. At least, in theory. Because in practice, China showed something very different. Most cars show variation. Moments where energy fades. Moments where drivers have to lift. Moments where performance drops. That's normal. That's expected. But Mercedes didn't show any of that. And that's what triggered the first real questions. Because when a system behaves too perfectly, people start looking closer. Now connect this to Verstappen again. Because his words now become context. He's describing the limits, the struggle, the reality of these regulations. And by doing that, he unintentionally highlights how far Mercedes is from those limits. Because if he's fighting the system, and Mercedes isn't, then one of them is operating in a completely different window. And that's where everything starts to escalate. Because teams are already analyzing the data. Looking at energy curves. Looking at how long Mercedes holds deployment. Looking at how smooth the power delivery is. And if they can't replicate it, they won't accept it. They will question it. That's how Formula One works. So this is no longer just about a dominant weekend. This is about a contradiction. Two completely different realities. On the same track. Under the same rules. And when that happens, the sport always reacts. So the real question is not whether Mercedes is fast. The real question is, how are they making something so difficult look so easy? Because if the answer to that goes beyond what the rules intended, then what happened in China was not just a performance. It was a signal. A signal that something bigger has already been discovered. And once something like that appears in Formula One, it never stays hidden for long. But here's where everything starts to get uncomfortable for everyone. Because once this kind of contradiction appears, it doesn't stay on track. It spreads into the paddock, into the data rooms, into the FIA. Because now, it's no longer about who won. It's about how they won. And that question is much more dangerous. Now imagine what rival teams are doing right now. They are not watching highlights. They are breaking down every lap, every straight, every throttle input, looking for one thing. Where is Mercedes gaining what we can't? Because if they can't find it, they won't accept it. They will push. Quietly at first. Then more directly. Now bring the FIA into this. Because their job is not just to enforce rules. It's to protect the balance of the sport. And when one team suddenly operates outside the expected behavior, they take notice. Not publicly, not dramatically, but very seriously. Because they don't look for obvious violations. They look for patterns. And right now, Mercedes is a pattern that doesn't match the rest. Now here's the key detail. The FIA doesn't need proof of something illegal to act. They only need something unclear. Something that sits in a gray area. Because in Formula One, gray areas don't last. They get defined. They get clarified. And when that happens, teams are forced to adjust. Now imagine what that means. If Mercedes' advantage comes from a very precise way of managing energy, a specific interaction between systems, then even a small clarification can remove that advantage instantly. Not reduce it, remove it. Because you're not just changing performance. You're removing the method that creates it. And that is much harder to recover. Now connect this to the timing. This is only the second race of the season. Which means, there is still time for everything to change. And that's what makes this moment so critical. Because what we saw in China might not be stable. It might be temporary. A peak. Before the system responds. Now bring Verstappen back into this one more time. Because his words are no longer just frustration. They are the trigger. They define the baseline. They describe what these cars are supposed to feel like. And by doing that, they make Mercedes look even more extreme. Because if that's the reality for everyone else, then Mercedes is operating outside of it. Again, not necessarily illegal, but different. And in Formula One, different never survives for long. So now everything leads to one moment. The next race. Because that's where pressure becomes visible. If Mercedes shows up, and everything looks the same, then they've done something extraordinary. Something the rest of the grid hasn't even understood yet. But if something changes, if the energy fades earlier, if the car looks slightly more difficult, if the gap begins to close, then we will know that what happened in China was not just dominance. It was a moment. A moment where Mercedes reached a level that forced the entire sport to react. And once Formula One starts reacting, the story never goes backwards, only forward. And what comes next might redefine the entire season. And if there is one thing Formula One has proven over and over again, it's that moments like this never stay unanswered. Because the sport doesn't allow one team to operate in a completely different reality for long. Not without understanding why. Not without reacting. Now think about what happens next. More races. More data. More pressure. Because China was just the first clear signal. The first time everything aligned. The first time the difference became impossible to ignore. But Formula One doesn't judge based on one race. It waits. It observes. It compares. Different circuits. Different conditions. Different energy demands. And that's where the truth begins to appear. Because if Mercedes can repeat that level of control everywhere, then there is no debate. They didn't just find performance. They solved the system. Completely. But if they can't, if even a small part of that consistency disappears, if the car starts to show the same limits as everyone else, then the conclusion becomes much bigger. Because it means something changed. Not just on track, but around it. In how the rules are interpreted. In how far teams are allowed to go. Now imagine that moment. The next race begins. Same drivers. Same cars. But everything feels different. More eyes. More scrutiny. More pressure on every lap Mercedes completes. And suddenly, the smallest change becomes visible. If the energy drops earlier, people will see it. If the straight line advantage shrinks, people will notice. If the car looks even slightly harder to drive, people will connect it. Because once doubt exists, everything becomes evidence. Now here's the final piece. Because everything we've built leads to this. China was not just a dominant weekend. It was a reveal. A moment where Mercedes showed the maximum potential of their concept. But also, a moment that triggered the entire sport to respond. The FIA, the rival teams, the media, everyone. And now, Mercedes has to prove something much harder than being fast. They have to prove that they can stay fast. Under pressure. Under scrutiny. Under changing conditions. Because that's the real challenge in Formula One. Not reaching the top. Staying there. So now everything comes down to one simple, but powerful question. Was China the beginning of a new era of dominance? Or was it the peak of something that the sport is already starting to control? Because the next race won't just give us more racing. It will give us the answer. And when that answer appears, everything we thought we understood will either be confirmed or completely rewritten. And this is where everything stops being theory and becomes reality. Because Formula One doesn't hide the truth. It reveals it. On track. Under pressure. When there's nowhere left to hide. Now imagine the next race weekend. Practice begins. All eyes on Mercedes. Not just on the lap times, but on the behavior. How the car moves. How it accelerates. How long it holds that energy on the straights. Because now, everyone knows what to look for. And that changes everything. Because when a team is being watched like this, every detail becomes a test. Every lap becomes a statement. Now picture qualifying. Mercedes goes out. Push lap. And for the first time, people are not just looking at the time on the screen. They're watching the final meters of the straight, waiting to see one thing. Does the power fade, or does it hold? Because that one detail tells the entire story. Now imagine the race. Lights out. Antonelli leads. Russell follows. Same as China. At first, everything looks identical. Smooth. Controlled. Untouchable. But then, a small change. Maybe the deployment drops earlier. Maybe the gap doesn't grow the same way. Maybe the car looks just a little harder to manage. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. But enough. Enough for engineers to notice. Enough for rivals to confirm their doubts. And that's how it starts. Not with a headline. Not with a penalty. With a difference. A subtle shift. That tells you something has changed. Now here's the moment that defines everything. Because if that shift appears, then China becomes something else entirely. Not the beginning, but the peak. The moment where Mercedes reached the absolute limit of what was possible, before the sport reacted. But if that shift never comes, if Mercedes remains just as dominant, just as consistent, just as controlled, then the answer is even bigger. Because that means they didn't just push the limits, they redefined them. And at that point, the rest of the grid is not just behind. They are lost. Now bring everything back to Verstappen. Because in the end, this entire story started with him. With one description, one perspective, one reality. A car that feels like survival. And by saying that, he created the perfect contrast. Because Formula One is now comparing that reality to Mercedes and asking one simple question. How can both exist at the same time? And that question is what will decide everything that comes next. Because the moment the sport finds the answer, the balance shifts, the narrative changes, the season takes its true direction. So this is it. The turning point. Not confirmed. Not declared. But already in motion. Because what happened in China was never going to stay isolated. It was always going to lead here. To this moment. Where everything is tested. Everything is questioned. And everything, finally, gets revealed.